Hi, my name's Adrian Smith. I'm a researcher at the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University, and this recording is part of an initiative from WiredSussex and with the support of the university. And the idea is to bring some of the tech community that WiredSussex supports and helps in the region into conversation with some of the research that a few of us are doing at Sussex University that's maybe of interest or relevant to them, perhaps also to their wider communities. So this is a presentation of some research I've been involved in at Sussex University about grassroots innovation movements, and I'm going to kind of just introduce that really. And then separate to this, there will be recordings of discussions with some of the kind of wide Sussex community that trying to relate this research to some of the work they do. Ideally, that would have happened at the Fuse Box, which is sort of the hub where WiredSussex does its work and can bring people together here in Brighton. But obviously with the pandemic and the restrictions, we're unable to do that. So we've moved it online. But if you like, nevertheless, to try and kind of place things where I am and where we are, if you like, online, I thought I'd start with this picture from Brighton's seafront. Where WiredSussex is based and where the University of Sussex is based and where indeed where I live. And if you look carefully on the horizon there, looking out to sea from Brighton, you can see the Rampion offshore wind farm, which was completed by the German multinational company E.ON in 2018. And it consists of, I think, about 116 turbines. They're 80 meters tall or so, and it's generating electricity, clean electricity, for something like the equivalent of 350,000 homes. It's generated 60 jobs in terms of operations and maintenance, and obviously it's providing lots of, there's also a community benefit fund that gives grants to local community organisations. About 15 or so each year can bid for or apply for grants of about £10,000 to try and help projects in the community as well. So it's a sort of example, if you like, of emblematic of this rapidly expanding global business, you know, in green technology business and the sorts of things we need for the transition to much more sustainable economies, arguably. And indeed, in the case of Rampion, there are also now discussions and early proposals about exploring the possibility of doubling the size of the wind farm and putting in, you know, as many turbines again that would generate, you know, electricity for up to a million homes. It's a tremendous engineering feat and tremendously important economically. Intriguingly, though, if we trace, and it's also an industry, if you like, that's been 40 or more years in the making, and that's sort of part of the reason I chose this image, if you like, because intriguingly, we want to trace the history of the development of wind turbines, wind energy as an industry. You trace it back to its early days. Origins, really, the early successes didn't come from industrial research and development or university-based research into wind turbine technology. Some of that was going on in the wake of the energy crises of the 1970s as an alternative to, you know, electricity generated from oil and coal and the new nuclear power stations back then. And so there was some government support for research into wind turbine technologies, but it was sort of not that enthusiastic, if you like. It was a bit stop and start. And actually the early days of the development of the wind industry was actually amongst sort of grassroots movements of alternative technologies in countries like Denmark and Germany as well, maybe, but also where who were kind of experimenting and developing much smaller scale wind turbines. Okay, and coming together and forming energy cooperatives to support the development of wind turbines, and it actually created this sort of social base, if you like, that was supportive of and would put up with, you know, some of the inconveniences of using these small scale turbines that were just very different to the vision for electricity back then, which is to have large centralized power stations feeding into the grid. These alternative technologists were interested in smaller, low energy demand communities, if you like, with wind turbines part of that feature. And they were able to improve on the designs of their turbines, as I say, create energy cooperatives and ways of kind of models for economic models for supporting that development. And because they had this social base, they were able to lobby some governments regionally, nationally, to provide some support. So allowing them to connect their machines to the electricity grid, if you like, and feed into the grid to get sort of subsidies and support to help them develop these sectors. So you had a social base and support that was able to lobby and enable the industry to get a foothold and develop and grow over time. But it began with these kinds of grassroots origins. And clearly Rampion is a long way from that, but there's a connection, if you like, historically between what we see offshore at Brighton and what the some of the pioneers were doing back then. There's also a vision then, though, that actually these were technologies for people, that actually communities would own some of these technologies, they'd have some control and say over them within these sort of, you know, sustainable energy locally. And also that they would be relatively, the ideals, if you like, they would be relatively sparing in their use of resources and materials. And that's important because if we look to at Rampion, some of the materials that are really important for these wind turbines are mined from other parts of the world, you know, exploiting resources from other parts of the world that impact on communities there and shape the kind of development opportunities for those communities, whether these mines are actually, you know, people are included in some of the benefits of those mines or not. So there's all sorts of questions, if you like, that these developments pose about who gets to benefit, who gets to participate, who gets to own these, and gets to exploit newly valuable resources like the wind and sun and so forth. Okay, there's all sorts of questions also around this example about the origins, if you like, how some of these initiatives take shape and form. There's all sorts of questions about what forms of sustainable development are we trying to promote and practice here, and what happens for people who maybe can't participate or struggle to pay electricity bills. How is these large wind energy developments helping people maybe who are in fuel poverty and so on and so forth? Okay, so what happens, you know, with groups who maybe don't benefit so much, and there's all sorts of, even today, all sorts of grassroots initiatives trying to help people in fuel poverty and community energy initiatives who are trying to think and develop sustainable energy in quite different forms to the green industrialization model, if you like, that Rampion that the Rampion offshore wind farm is sort of emblematic of, if you like. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, is some of these kinds of grassroots innovation movements and how we've been researching them, if you like, and why they may be of interest or significant to debates about sustainable developments. You know, whilst it's great that our policymakers and industry is investing in a green industrialization, maybe we also need to keep another eye on kind of some of these grassroots developments, because maybe some of the initiatives today in clothing, say, or in repair or what have you, may actually provide opportunities to developing into new industries in the future, or they're simply important because they're actually considering sustainability for some of those who aren't able to participate or are included in some of these larger industrial developments. And actually also because they are emblematic, some of the grassroots initiatives are thinking about sustainable developments in quite different ways to the large-scale rollouts of technologies like offshore wind or other clean tech industries globally. You know, the vision for some of these grassroots initiatives may be for a different kind of sustainable development, and that's really important, I think, in terms of addressing some of these questions about whose voice comes to count in sustainable development, who gets to share in the benefits, how impacts across different parts of the world kind of interconnect and so forth. And if you like some pluralizing models and developments is really, really important for democratic debate about sustainable development. So showing you a picture of Brighton has led to quite a long-winded introduction to what I'm talking about, and just raising some of these themes about who's shaping technologies, who owns them, and so on and so forth. And actually, Brighton, like many places, if you look carefully, there are all sorts of grassroots initiatives trying to promote sustainable developments. So alongside Rampion, we have organisations like Brighton Energy Cooperative, which is promoting solar development cooperatively in Brighton. But we also have all sorts of grassroots initiatives promoting different forms of mobility, such as Bike Hub, or different ways of providing food and urban food initiatives, seed swapping initiatives. There have been initiatives in grassroots initiatives in coming up with ecological designs for buildings and passive solar buildings, or shared housing and new forms of housing. And then we have things like Fusebox, which are enabling people to explore new technologies and what their potentials are for livelihoods, or what their implications may be for society. Of course, Brighton's not particularly unusual in that. And if you like, I mean, how we got interested at the University of Sussex, and with collaborators at other universities, was noticing all of this kind of what typically is considered to be community development or local environmental action. And we were intrigued, actually, if you look carefully what people are doing here, it's really, really innovative. It's, you know, they made some of these things, these initiatives may look relatively sort of, I don't know, simple in what they're doing, but they're doing it under quite challenging circumstances, and actually involving quite specialist knowledge, if you like. So, you know, kind of expertise about the dynamics of the neighbourhood where the activities taking place, knowledge about using maybe some of the technologies, or knowledge about how to organise initiatives. And that's really, really important if we're thinking about, it's really valuable knowledge and expertise and capabilities when we're thinking about trying to embed new sustainable practices in communities and actually, you know, get people practicing this stuff. And Brighton's not unique or particularly special in that. If you look all around the world, there's all sorts of grassroots initiatives that are being innovative and that have led to all sorts of innovations. And as you can see in this list here and these images, you know, there are innovations around, you know, cooperative electric car clubs, all sorts of renewable energy initiatives, devices for, you know, using bicycles and bicycle power as a source of mechanical power for things like mobile laundering or food processing and so forth in different contexts, community internet and radio and so forth. So the more you kind of look, the more you'll see this real wealth of kind of grassroots innovative activity where people are trying to, either for reasons of necessity and lack, markets or states simply aren't providing services or aren't providing them effectively, say like water. So then people come together and organisations and activists and NGOs help them to do things like rainwater harvesting to try and address some of their needs. So there's a sort of a lack and a need here, but also maybe for reasons of more idealistic reasons, or the lack isn't a kind of physical necessity, but it's more a dissatisfaction with the forms in which some of these, you know, housing is provided or mobility is provided conventionally, and they want to, maybe for all reasons of commitment to social and ecological values, they're doing initiatives to try and do these things in very, very different ways. And that's kind of, if you like, how we understand grassroots innovation. So it's sort of networks of neighbours, organisations coming together and enabling people to do innovative things, whether that's in terms of social organisation and practices, whether it's in terms of appropriating technologies or developing technologies. Now, these are the sorts of things we've been interested in trying to investigate and accompany and learn from people's experiences in doing these sort of grassroots initiatives. And intriguingly, the ability for people to do this, to kind of prototype and experiment, I don't know, it seems to be opening up. I mean, so another kind of emblem for this, if you like, if kind of the Rampion wind farms are emblematic for new green industries, what might be emblematic for grassroots innovation kind of capabilities has been this sort of growth in things like maker spaces and open workshops in cities, towns and villages around the world in recent years, and this sort of opening up of technology and encouraging people to get involved and providing facilities where they can materialize their ideas, if you like, meet other people, tinker and experiment, create projects that matter to them, and that these spaces that are increasingly networked online as well, and you can kind of, where you can share your ideas, conceive of knowledge and skills as a commons for people to be able to access, that enables you to maybe explore and be entrepreneurial in your workshop, but connected to other people and places around the world. So if you like, what's intriguing here with these sorts of spaces and workshops is not the question of whether there's a sort of redistribution of prototyping capabilities in societies going on here that allow people to do things, and maybe allows them, including if they have a sort of interest in sustainable development or to experiment with different ways of creating, visualizing, and doing things that anticipate different forms of sustainability. So if you like, opening up material culture to wider participation and providing another way for people to kind of deliberate about what sustainable transformations may or may not mean. An interesting initiative recently in that vein, coordinated by Media Lab Prado in Madrid, which is a kind of cultural centre, a public institution there, has been the development of citizen laboratories and networks of citizen laboratories around the Spanish-speaking world predominantly. And a sort of recent initiative back in sort of September, October last year, run online, was to provide people with training and facilities and encourage them to open up citizen laboratories where people can do innovative things in their communities. So there's a methodology that they promote. There's sort of connecting people and launching kind of invitations for people to just propose their ideas to their local citizen innovation laboratory, and then see if there's enough interest from other citizens to get involved in that initiative, and to develop the idea to try and improve or provide some service or improve something in their neighborhood. Okay, so here's a sort of process, if you like, that's sort of facilitated, that allows people to join together, incubate communities, do innovative things, and sort of see what happens, really. And in this case, the most recent one, which was connected to libraries, so rethinking libraries, running them, opening up citizen laboratories and citizen innovation services, led to the creation of 76 laboratories kind of opened up for a period in 15 different countries, and people kind of identified and brought together and made happen around 200 or more projects, and with many participants. So if you like, this is just an example of how, if you like, one could try and facilitate, as an public institution, facilitate and accompany and help some of these sorts of grassroots innovation initiatives, and reveal and make visible what's going on out there below the radar of conventional innovation institutions. So that's sort of, I don't know, try and give you a flavour of what we mean by grassroots innovation and movements and activities and what's going on. And now I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing at Sussex University and with others, and specifically a project that led to the publication of a book a few years ago called Grassroots Innovation Movements. And the project came out of the STEPS Research Centre at the University of Sussex. STEPS stands for Social, Technological and Environmental Pathways to Sustainability, and was a 15-year funded research centre, more or less, that did a whole variety of work about pathways to sustainability and different configurations, socially, technologically, environmentally. And I was involved in the research into grassroots innovation movements with colleagues Mariano Fresoli at Fundación CENIT in Buenos Aires, Dinesh Abral at JNU University in Delhi, Elise Arond, who was at the Graduate School of Geography in the US at that point in time, and then my colleague Adrian Ely at SPRU, the Science Policy Research Unit. And what we were fortunate to do was not so much research. So we were aware of all this grassroots innovation activity, and we didn't want to so much research specific innovations, but we really wanted to study instead sort of networks or movements of activity that were trying to promote grassroots innovation more generally, and trying to promote citizen appropriations of technologies, citizens do creative things with technologies. So we did 6 studies, if you like, within this Grassroots Innovations project. We studied 6 different kind of movements or networks to promote what we were calling grassroots innovation from different places and different times around the world. Okay. So, for example, on the top right in this image, we looked at the social technologies network that was originated in Brazil and spread to a number of other countries in South America, that kind of ran from the sort of like 2000s into early 2010s. Okay, and social technology is still practiced in Brazil. But we were looking at that network was one of our case studies. Another example was the honeybee network in India, which documents and promotes and helps support grassroots inventors and grassroots innovators in India. We looked at the appropriate technology, the historical experience from the appropriate technology in South America, which flourished in the 1970s and 1980s. Back in India, we looked at the people's science movement, which was originated in the 1960s and has been going through till the present day. And then in the UK, we looked at the movement for socially useful production that came from kind of grassroots trade unionists and workers in manufacturing plants and manufacturing industry in the period back then, and we're arguing for the right to socially useful production. And then also we did a study into the growth and spread of hacker spaces and maker spaces I was talking about in one of the previous slides. So these were the sort of 6 case studies, if you like, that we were looking at, and we wanted to understand in each case how they organised themselves into networks and promoted grassroots innovation, how they were sharing knowledge and resources and methods and providing kind of facilities for grassroots innovators, how they were training people and cultivating capabilities, the kind of advocacy and lobbying that they were doing to try and get wider attention and wider support, say from policy or innovation institutions, to promote grassroots innovation. And we also wanted to understand some of the challenges and dilemmas and setbacks they were experiencing, as well as some of the successes, if you like. And in each case, we wanted to situate them in their context and in their history, try and understand what led to this kind of flourishing of activity and networks. We wanted to understand the kind of context, therefore, in which they were operating and developing. We wanted to understand some of the strategies that they were promoting and using to try and cultivate and expand grassroots innovation, and also some of the sort of visions they had for why grassroots innovations was important, visions of development that they were committed to and wanted to promote through grassroots activity, and the sorts of pathways, how they kind of developed over time, and what led to, in some cases, their demise, what maybe endured beyond that flourishing of the movement and its eventual demise. And clearly, with some of these examples, they're still very much active, still very much succeeding in promoting grassroots innovation. I'm not going to go into each of them in detail. There's the book, and there's all sorts of materials on various websites, which I'll mention at the end of the discussion. But I just wanted to draw out, if you like, some recurring themes or some important points that came out amidst these diverse cases and amidst these diverse examples, and maybe point to something that's really quite important and fundamental if, say, policymakers or institutions for promoting innovation are become interested in grassroots innovation and would like to try and help accompany it and develop it. So that's what I'm going to talk about in some of the sort of subsequent slides. The first thing that's important that we learn, if you like, it's important to bear in mind, is, if you like, the things that are being produced by these grassroots innovation movements, the sort of wealth and variety of things that they are developing. So it's not just about specific artifacts or services or organizational forms, if you like. That's really important. But these networks are also cultivating different forms of knowledge, varieties of knowledge, lots of skills and techniques as well, new methods, say in participatory design. They're also producing and reinforcing narratives and concepts about innovation. So narratives around the right for people to be involved, the importance, say, of democratizing technologies and so forth. These movements are also coming from and reinforcing and helping create communities. They're incubating communities, and they're building new social relations in respect to innovation, in respect to development. They're expressing different social values as well, and maybe even thinking about different kinds of economic models in their practices. And finally, what's being produced here as well are different identities and subjectivities, such as makers or hackers, for example, yeah, or grassroots entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. So it's really important to keep in view this variety and diversity of sort of things, if you like, that are being produced by these movements. And so while there may be some very eye-catching specific initiatives and specific artifacts, we shouldn't lose sight of all the other things going on here that make that possible, or that may also be interesting and important to invest in and nurture and accompany and support and recognise from a sort of sustainable development point of view. Another really important thing, this is a kind of copy of a table from the introductory chapter of the book actually, is to notice that, if you like, the settings of innovation in these grassroots innovation movements are very different to how we might think about innovation through conventional science, technology and innovation institutions. So if you look at this table here, some of the, in terms of the protagonists, the priorities, the incentives and drivers, the resources available and that are involved, the locations where this activity is taking place, the forms of knowledge that are kind of prioritized or valued, how that knowledge is appropriated, and kind of emblematic fields of activity. Look at the column where about grassroots innovation movements. This is a very different world compared to science, technology and innovation institutions. The protagonists around these movements are local communities, activists, civil society organisations, social entrepreneurs, maybe worker cooperatives, and it's all associated with wider social movements. In comparison with where the sort of protagonists in conventional science, technology, innovation, which are the universities and research centres, venture capital, entrepreneurs, science ministries and firms and so forth. So the protagonists are quite different. Their priorities are also quite different as well. A lot of grassroots innovation movements are trying about sort of social values and building up convivial communities, maybe local economic empowerment and livelihoods and sustainable developments. Whereas often the priorities of our conventional innovation institutions is all about the codification of knowledge, economic growth and developing technologies for competitiveness and winning and making new markets. The incentives and drivers are quite distinct. Social need, voluntarism, cooperation in the case of some of these grassroots innovation movements, versus sort of expert authority, reputation, market demand in science and technology institutions using the expertise and authority of science to create and develop new markets for high technologies and so forth. The resources involved, or the resources that these innovators can draw upon, is distinct in these two different worlds. Okay, so maybe it's development assistance or grants or social capital, public finance perhaps, and grassroots ingenuity and local volunteer energy and so forth for the resources in grassroots innovation movements, as distinct from the sort of public finance, corporate investment, venture capital, and sort of human resources, scientific expertise and training that are evident and important in kind of innovation systems as conventionally understood. Locations of activity are distinct. Grassroots innovation is taking place in villages, in factories, neighbourhoods, community projects, as distinct from some of the laboratories and R&D centres or the boardrooms where key decisions are made about what kinds of innovation to invest in and develop and promote, or in the ministries and civil service offices associated with innovation policy, and so on. So this kind of table kind of draws a distinction, maybe overemphasizes some of these distinctions, but I think it's important to recall that, if you like, the settings that grassroots innovations are emerging from and networking are quite different to the institutions that we've developed historically and have currently to promote science, technology, and innovation. Okay, so it's just really important to keep those distinctions in mind, particularly when, if you like, maybe for reasons of seeking greater social inclusion or wanting to promote sustainable development, some of our institutions for innovation notice and seek to encourage and engage with grassroots activity. And it's really important. One of the things we found in researching these different diverse movements, if you like, was how grassroots encounter institutions of innovation, how, if you like, how those two columns encounter one another and meet and interact. And there are a couple of dynamics, broadly speaking, that we noticed that create certain tensions that can be creative but also problematic. And so that's what I want to talk about briefly now with this. The first kind of encounter is where our existing institutions for innovations act like filters, if you like. So they become interested in grassroots innovation, or some of the movements, if you like, trying to promote grassroots innovation, like say the Honeybee Network, facilitate and enable these grassroots innovators to enter into these institutions and get benefits in terms of investment or help in developing their ideas and commercializing them into new innovations. Okay, so if you like, but in those processes of building up grassroots innovation and helping insert it into our science, technology and innovation institutions, maybe under the banner of inclusive innovation, what happens is we get a kind of filtering, if you like. So maybe promising artifacts or useful knowledge or particular skills or methods get filtered into and scaled up through our existing innovation institutions, okay, and lead to new marketable innovations and enterprises. And that's the main sort of dynamic, really, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's, you know, a good way of kind of scaling up and rolling out some of the ingenuity of grassroots innovation. But there's another way, particularly some of the more kind of committed activists linked maybe to social movements, that are in promoting grassroots innovation, they're seeking something much more transformational. Their vision is for new kinds of institutions that can support the circulation of grassroots innovation capabilities in all their richness and in all their variety. Okay, so rather than acting as a filter and taking things that make sense or that are profitable or that speak to policy agendas of existing institutions, what they're seeking is transform new institutional designs that would allow the capabilities for grassroots innovation to circulate more widely. Okay, so if you like, maybe a filter institution might sort of see a really neat artifact and or design or technology use. They'll associate that with a particular inventor or a particular organization, and they'll try and help them commercialize that innovation. So that's the filter institution route, if you like. That's fine, but maybe that overlooks some of the networks and communities that were involved also in developing and helping the specific inventor or innovator that's now generating a kind of enterprise. Some of the earlier networks and some of the settings that were really important and valuable to development of that grassroots innovation are overlooked, okay, and excluded from that development process. Whereas the transformative innovations may be trying to see the innovation as an open, free cultural process, if you like, involving networks of people, and it's trying to think how you might have institutions that can enable and invest in those processes. Okay, so maybe rather than scaling up your innovations, you're trying to scale down your institutions to accompany and better support grassroots innovations. And some of the features, if you like, for those more transformative innovations, some of those things that they may need to have if we're thinking about designing them are the following in this list here. And if you like, the filter institutions kind of happens anyway. So in our studies, we saw that some features of these grassroots innovation movements were mainstreaming, if you like, that when policymakers and multilateral organizations became interested in inclusive innovation or appropriate technologies or social technologies or what have you, they would do that filtering. That kind of dynamic happens anyway. And where maybe we need to to more attention and do much more thinking and argue for greater public support through policies is the development and design of these transformative institutions. So thinking about how our institutions for science, technology and innovation could be much more skilled in actively listening to communities and to the grassroots, if you like, or to neighbourhoods or to particular social groups, including a listening that's attentive for absences and silences in the development of innovation agendas or the way that technologies are conceived and thought and used. Okay, institutions that recognise the distinct perspectives, motivations and aspirations of people and different groups, that can facilitate dialogue and explore what groups can do together actively and bring them together, provide open platforms and maybe welcoming infrastructures that aren't so intimidating to groups that are not normally represented and present in conventional innovation, and that maybe are doing interesting things at grassroots level, and maybe enabling collaboration, experimentation and creativity. What's really important in all of this is documenting what's going on, sharing information about activities, sharing experiences and caring for knowledge and evidence of what's going on as a kind of commons that's open to all. Okay, so it's a very different way of thinking about knowledge compared to, say, intellectual property regimes. We're recognizing that in opening this knowledge in this way, you are facilitating maybe more rapid circulation of innovative activity and greater participation, potentially. Institutions that really can accompany and support these activities rather than direct and drive them and select and use them in kind of narrowly instrumental ways, seeing this much more broadly as cultivating innovative capabilities in societies. And therefore, institutions that are really ambidextrous, that can switch between different funding and resource models as appropriate, whether that's seeing these facilities and innovations as a public service like libraries, it's just something you invest in and you promote and you encourage, okay? Or you see them as having commercial potential as enterprises or as social enterprises, or commons-based kinds of models, okay? So helping people to set up some activity as a commons where people govern and decide who's participating and who's benefiting, or maybe hybrids between these models. And I think we need much more research on that, on the sustainability of these sorts of new forms of innovation for the broader vision of sustainable societies. And finally, and really, really important, institutions to be transformative, that are able to kind of learn and reflect on what they're doing and change this list here that's come out of our research, but actually in light of experience will need to be revised and changed and altered because it's problematic, or it makes assumptions that are, don't bear fruit, or we're overlooking things. So that reflexivity and learning is really, really important in transformative institutions. Now, it's not all easy to say, but obviously in practice, there are quite deep-seated social and economic structures that disadvantage this kind of institution, okay? There are sunk investments, there are jobs and livelihoods associated with conventional science, technology, institutions and innovations, and they're very, very important. And so opening space for experimenting and thinking about innovation in a different way and cultivating transformative institutions is a political task as much as it is a policy task. And so we need that awareness and mobilizing these wider awareness and thinking about actually recognizing that this is a question of politics and of democracy. And that was definitely there with some of the movements we studied, if you like. They weren't simply promoting specific grassroots innovation and helping people network. Often there were visions and ideas about practicing a different type of economic and social development that were very challenging to incumbent institutions. They were born of struggles and opposition to the way technology and development was being conceived by powerfully situated organizations and actors and ideologies, okay? So the appropriate technology movements in South America, but not just there, but the ones we studied in the 1970s and 1980s, they were questioning the importation of industrialization models and models about economic catch-up to a kind of universal technological frontier, and then the kind of modernity that had been coming out of say, Europe and so forth, and the sort of colonization of different life worlds. And they were interested in thinking about innovation and technologies in ways that were maybe a bit more appropriate to and coming from some of the kind of aspirations and worldviews of indigenous communities, say, or that were more appropriate to a different kind of model of development for the region. So it generated lots of instrumentally useful technologies, arguably, and cultivated things that are of wide interest now around the world, such as agroecological practices for food. But what was generative of them were these kind of different visions for a different kind of world to the ones that maybe some of their national governments or international organizations were promoting and developing. Okay. Similarly, with hacker spaces and maker spaces, you know, these are kind of quite cool spaces for playing with technologies and maybe opening up and making interesting technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, should we say. But for some groups in these spaces, there's a vision for democratizing technology, opening up technology, thinking about technologies as a commons, and trying to institute commons-based peer production activities where these technologies and skills and knowledge about them is a global commons, open to peers, okay, and trying to figure out new ways of governing that then is a resource that can be drawn down into local communities for local forms of manufacture using these highly versatile digital design and fabrication technologies. There's quite a different vision compared to the fourth industrial revolution that national governments are investing in massively to try and not get left behind by these new global manufacturing and logistics systems. Some of these makerspace houses trying to practice a completely different kind of world of technological development. Same with the social technologies network in Brazil that we were looking at. Whilst funders and some within the networks were promoting kind of low-cost, pro-poor technologies to commodify and roll out and help people, it's very important and sort of meaningful activity. Others in the network were drawing on histories and traditions that seeing that these technologies had to be developed in a participatory way. They had to involve the beneficiary communities, if you like, or the ideas had to emerge from communities, because the social technologies were as much about local empowerment, figuring out new forms of local economic development, and part and parcel of a kind of social movement that was looking for a different development model. Okay, at that point in time. And that created tensions, and the social technologies network in Brazil ultimately kind of fragmented, you know, because of these tensions between different ideas and visions behind what was being done, and that therefore led to different strategies for promoting and developing them. People's science movement, which is still important in India today, was born in kind of, you know, post-colonial India, and trying to think of different ways of thinking about science and technology that was distinct from some of the currents that had led to that informed some of the freedom movements in India and the history of throwing off colonialism, and the arguments between, say, a kind of Gandhian vision of village self-sufficiency that had been very, very important on the one hand, and then the kind of Nehruvian vision of rapid modernization and industrial development of a kind of post-colonial India. And the People's Science Movement were trying to think and find ways of thinking about science and technology, maybe on a regional scale that was quite different to those sort of two strands in Indian sort of thought and politics. And then the movement for socially useful production in the UK, you know, they were creating at the GLC in London in the early 80s community workshops where people could come in and prototype and develop ideas and so forth. And the workers were developing designs, but this was linked to a socialist project, a different route to kind of rescue manufacturing decline in the UK. came out of a kind of democratic socialist movement that was promoting these activities and this socially useful production, that ultimately lost out to the rise of sort of Thatcherism and leaving technology choices to the market, whereas what these sort of workers were promoting was, no, we should be democratizing workplace, democratizing investment, because we have the knowledge and skills to develop socially useful products that should be manufactured, make use of all this manufacturing capability for socialized markets where people can get access to socially useful products. Okay, so there's a different vision for what to do with struggling UK manufacturing at that time, and was plugged into a kind of Europe-wide movements and networks on this as well. And obviously it was very different to, leaving manufacturing decline to the market, so to speak, and what happened. Nevertheless, some of those activities behind that, within that idealism, practices in participatory design, which were quite strange back then in the 1970s, have now kind of diffused and become like everyday practices in manufacturing and in all sorts of areas around the world. So when we think about grassroots innovation movements, we need also to, I think, to sort of think about some of the visions that are motivating them, the kind of multiplicity of worlds that they're trying to promote and develop, and not just see these grassroots initiatives on narrow instrumental terms, but part of maybe broader social phenomena, and think about these social bases, because they can be really, really necessary and important in transforming our institutions of science, technology, and innovation. The institutional developments that have led to and are enabling the things like the Green New Deal, things like the Rampion offshore wind farm, and the cultivation and development of new green industries, those institutional reforms that have brought us this far have been shaped by social pressure and social movement, and getting reforms from policymakers and from governments, and putting pressure on businesses to change their practices. And now these industries are developing and expanding rapidly and globalizing around the world, and raising all sorts of other questions about sustainable developments and who gets to benefit and gets a voice and who gets to share in these things. So the requirement now is, if you like, ensuring there are grassroots movements and grassroots innovations that are, if you like, trying to materialize and keep open discussions and debates about what's the right forms and directions of sustainable development. At least that's what we learned when we did the research into grassroots innovation movements that informed the books. And I hope that's been interesting to you, and I look forward to the discussions at WiredSussex about what this might mean for technologists now who, so that's where I'll finish. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's all sorts of resources on the STEP Centre website, including this blog that kind of discusses and explains in a bit more about many of the things I've been talking about here. And then there's another website that's got all sorts of information and resources around grassroots innovation. So thanks for sticking with me this far, if you have done. I hope this has been interesting, and feel free to get in touch.